really doesn't need an introduction with this particular audience, but I'm going to introduce her anyway. She's an associate professor of English at Syracuse University, where she teaches a variety of graduate and undergraduate courses on critical race and ethnic studies, gender and sexuality studies, and Arab American literatures and cultures. A recipient of an NEH Summer Grant and a Future of Minority Studies Fellowship, her essays on gender, race, ethnicity, war trauma, and transnational citizenship in Arab and Arab American literary texts have appeared in a variety of journals, including Mellows, Modern Fiction Studies, College Literature, as well in Retold, Exploring Identity Through Writing, and Arab Voices in Diaspora, among others. She is the author of Contemporary Arab American Literature, Transnational Reconfigurations of Home and Belonging, from New York University Press in 2014. This book analyzes the ways in which depictions of Arab homelands in Arab American literary and cultural texts from the 1990s onwards play a crucial role in reshaping cultural articulations of U.S. citizenship and belonging. Her new book project is titled Carceral States and Dissident Citizenships, Narratives of Resistance in an Age of Terror, quote unquote, terror. She serves as the editor of the Critical Arab American Studies book series at Syracuse University Press. And on a more personal note, Carol is a graduate of the AUB English department, both as where she obtained both her MA and her BA degrees. So the title of her talk this evening is Narrative Cartographies of Citizenships and Rights in the Age of U.S. Empire. Please welcome Carol Fadda.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy, for the introduction, and thank you, Kaysar, for the invitation, and for Siren and Amy for hosting me. This has been lovely, and it's so nice to be giving a talk to an audience with many familiar faces. This is such a treat. Thank you. So my talk today is based on a new book project that I'm working on. And it is titled Narrative Cartographies of Citizenships and Rights in the Age of U.S. Empire. So I have a slideshow here. So on October 17, 2016, Muhammadu Wuld Slahi was transferred from the high security prison of Guantanamo Bay to Mauritania, where he was greeted by family, friends, and fellow Mauritanians after 15 years of imprisonment by the U.S. with no charges. Expressing how thrilled he was to reunite with his family and loved ones, he stated, quote, "I feel grateful and indebted to the people who have stood by me. I have come to learn that goodness is transnational, transcultural, and transethnic," unquote. Slahi's story itself prior to his arrival in Guantanamo Bay is intricately shaped by transnational passages and border crossings, some of which he chose while others he didn't. Born in Mauritania in 1970, Slahi attended college in Germany on a scholarship, and in the early 1990s, he fought alongside the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviets with the support of the US. He then moved to Germany and worked there as an engineer, returning to Mauritania in 2000 after moving to Montreal for a short time in 1999. In 2001, after the 9/11 attacks, he was handed over by the Mauritanian police to US authorities, who rendered him to a prison in Jordan, then to Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan, and finally in August 2002 to the US prison at Guantanamo Bay, where he was subjected to severe torture. His book, Guantanamo Diary, which he wrote by hand 3 years into his captivity, was on the New York Times bestseller list for 3 weeks without him knowing it, and was translated into dozens of languages, garnering him global support and attention. Initially written as a 466-page handwritten manuscript, of redacted manuscript, and this is censored by the US government. Guantanamo Diary, published in 2015, which was declassified after 7 years of litigation, but heavily redacted, as I said, by the US government to withhold alleged classified information. It chronicles the torture that Slahi was subjected to and its effects, as well as his thoughts and feelings and the bonds he formed with some of his Guantanamo guards during his confinement. In my talk today, I analyzed testimonials by Arab and Muslim detainees of the so-called War on Terror to show how they undertake, delineate, and complicate dominant understandings of homes, rights, citizenships, and belongings, and at the same time help reshape literary genres, specifically here looking at the genre of the testimonial and the memoir. In addition to Guantanamo Diary, some other testimonials that I will discuss today include ones by the Abu Ghraib prisoners, as they are specifically incorporated into the poetry of Arab-American writer Philip Mitras in his book Sand Opera, as well as the testimonials of the Yemeni prisoner Muhammad Farag Ahmad Bashmillah about his experiences of being locked up in US-managed secret sites, experiences that are also included in Mitras's book, Sand Opera. I argue that these stark testimonials create discursive spaces that unsettle the discourse of exceptionalism, defining the US nation state as a vulnerable homeland in need of protection, which is the logic behind the War on Terror. At the same time, they challenge the gendered and racialized logics at the heart of such discourse. These texts, while documenting and questioning the materialities of US carceral sites, at the same time complicate assumptions of detainees' humanity based solely on their ability to speak or write. So, in other words, this text power is not only about or showcasing the ability of these detainees to speak and thus prove their humanity. Such complications, I would argue, resist what Jody Melamed has called the neoliberal multiculturalist impulse undergirding the writing, reading, and marketing practices of literature and its production on a global scale, especially in the context of the wars and terror and the prevalent Western urge to self-gratifyingly know the other by reading their harrowing plights and experiences as written by them or about them. So this is something that we are very familiar with through a mainstream publishing industry that has been extremely attentive and focused on producing books. And here we see some of the book covers that have come out after 9/11, featuring women in the veil, and a lot of them capture a sensationalist approach to showcasing experiences of Muslim women in the Muslim world. And I was just in Virgin and Antoine yesterday, and I also noticed that there's a lot of books that showcase also how I escaped ISIS. And so just to kind of think about that in terms of what is the publishing industry doing that in showcasing these kinds of experiences, and what is it responding to? What kind of audiences is it hailing or imagining in that sense? So these books, more than merely documenting, the testimonials that I'm focusing on, more than merely documenting the materialities of what Lala Khalili calls detentions and shadows, books like Slahi's and Mitras's text raise compelling questions about detainees' perspectives and positionalities. So some of these questions include, how do these perspectives disrupt hegemonic national narratives of homeland security and rights, and thus underscore the underlying violence of US empire? In what ways do the detainees' portrayals of their subject positions through testimonials and literary narratives revise binaristic understandings of homes, communities, and belongings? And how do these portrayals ultimately help us reconceptualize the role of literary and narrative expression in constructions of nations and citizenships? So in order to start addressing some of these questions, I want to briefly reflect on the role of testimonials and their position in relation to the genre of life writing generally, to think through how testimonials would shape understandings of life writing, particularly in light of questions around human rights and representation, and the geopolitical moments from which these testimonials narratives emanate. In her book, Post-Colonial Life Narratives, Gillian Whitlock focuses on what she calls testimonial transactions that move beyond nation and narration to track transnational and transcultural passages of life narrative, its volatile currency and value, and its changing technologies of the self. This is her definition. So this articulation of testimonial transactions as transnational is helpful in the way it would draw citizenship for one, beyond the bounds of limited national frameworks into the transnational, and at the same time challenge a decontextualized and depoliticized enactment of global citizenship. Drawing on Frantz Fanon, Whitlock works through this idea of making the human, of the making of the human in and through testimonial transactions, pointing to how other, arguably more established forms of life writing, such as autobiography, are limited in how they are hierarchically shaped by and assessed through Western Enlightenment values, with their emphasis, for example, on authenticity, autonomy, self-realization, etc. So testimonials are more and more largely testimonial narratives that emphasize the collective rather than the individual, as well as post-colonial and anti-imperial impulses, become sites that necessitate and stress new strategies of reading cultural production as transnational and intertextual, especially in what Derek Gregory refers to as the colonial present. Testimonial narratives coming out of the War on Terror and its carceral sites, for one, directly highlight and at the same time interrogate the neo-colonial and imperialist modalities that undergird the current geopolitical moment. But these testimonial narratives are not without their limitations, particularly in the way they generate acts of readerly empathy. For an emphasis on making the human in and through these texts should be one that extends beyond or transcends proving the humanity of the author or speaker, to reveal and at the same time challenge the workings of the nation state that deploys gendered, racist, and colonialist logics to restrict and prescribe this humanity, particularly through the trope of citizenship and rights. So, in other words, the end result is not for the subaltern or the marginalized to speak and thus prove his or her humanity. The aim is to lay bare the ways in which structures of human value and rights are attached to certain bodies and not others, based on cultural citizenships shaped by political, racial, religious, gendered, and sexual identities. The question then becomes, whose rights, human or civil, should be valued? What kind of citizenships are formulated within a global sphere? Whose citizenships are relevant and to whom? And how does that shift our understandings of Western and specifically US-centric understandings of the MENA region? By centering Muslim and Arab voices that counter hegemonic Western narratives of the War on Terror. So it is at the intersections of such discourses and materialities around human rights, citizenship, and testimonial narratives that the text I will now turn to, or in fact where they lie, or in fact where they fall through the cracks. So these texts emanate from a context of illegal incarceration, made permissible and real through exceptionalist logics mobilized by US imperial agendas in the name of US national security. The testimonies in both Guantanamo Diary and Sand Opera are the product of a complex web of transnational, geopolitical, and transhistorical erasures. They make visible and starkly immediate and accessible the experiences of Arab and Muslim men incarcerated in secret sites beyond the easy reach of legal and humanitarian relief agencies. Even though the location of Guantanamo Bay, unlike the other US-managed carceral sites in different parts of the world, is known, we know where Guantanamo Bay is, it nevertheless occupies an anomalous position in an international legal context. So the US leases this territory from Cuba, which means that Cuba has no legal jurisdiction over this territory, and that the United States has no legal sovereignty. As an extraterritorial location, the American Constitution holds no sway there. So the incarcerated, termed enemy combatants rather than prisoners, have neither the rights they might have under the Geneva Conventions, nor, as Amy Kaplan points out, do they have the constitutional rights as aliens they would have if held on US territory. So testimonials provided by these prisoners then become a way to not only chronicle the painful conditions and treatments that they endured, but they become a way to shed light on these unknown, hidden, and inaccessible sites as spaces of torture and violence. Laying this violence bare to the public would then complicate understandings and constructions of citizenship, both in its legal and cultural sense, as to regarding not only who is valid through citizenship, but how are concepts of citizenship lived and imagined in ways that assert the dominance and worth of certain bodies over others. I would argue that the radicalism of such acts of telling, again, are not only embodied in the acts of testifying or the official testimonies given by many of the prisoners, but is also reproduced and reenacted through the development of these testimonies into testimonials and subsequently literary narratives, or more specifically, life-writing narratives with all the possibilities as well as limitations that they entail. So Guantanamo Diary, again, as I mentioned, is written by Muhammadu Wold Slahi and edited by Larry Seams, is in fact often categorized as a mix between memoir and diary, one that is nevertheless severely constricted given the redaction and erasures that riddle the text. So it is these redactions, I would argue, that move the text beyond the frameworks or limits of prescribed genres, such as the memory or memoir or the diary, to emphasize the element of testimonial that is at the core of this narrative. For reading the text as a testimonial through its articulation of the violence enacted on the body of Slahi and his co-inmates, as well as through the redacted and truncated form of the text, which points to the surveillance and censorship of the state, here the US state, compels us to attend to the ways in which the text might exceed the literary cadres of the memoir, for one. So I'm not implying here that these genres are mutually exclusive and that they're always insular, contained, and thus separate. Reading the text primarily as a testimonial removes it from a decontextualized emphasis on the writer's humanity to emphasize how the ethics and values, or lack therefore, applied to Slahi's brown and Muslim body are shaped by state discourse dictating who falls inside and outside dominant understandings of citizenship and belonging, one here that extends into global and transnational sphere. And I would also add here that what these texts and how I'm thinking about these texts is also a way to draw a certain kind of critical readership from the audience rather than depend on these notions of these texts providing us or showing us the writer's humanity. But there's also a certain responsibility on the reader to kind of unpack what these texts are doing and how they're being circulated and constructed in specific ways. So many of the book's reviewers describe it using language that emphasizes this discourse of humanism, with one reviewer describing it as, quote, an honest and humble cry from prison for justice and humanity. Its pages reflect an intelligent human being, befuddled, betrayed, battered, but still capable of humor and heart, unquote. But, as Dara Lee reminds us, a reading of this book must exceed the liberal discourse of critics, and I would add readers generally, to acknowledge it as what Lee calls an extraordinary artifact of US empire at the dawn of the 21st century, an empire that operates mostly through indirect control abroad while building a racialized carceral state of unprecedented proportions at home. So here Lee is really connecting the prison industrial complex in the US with the military industrial complex abroad that the US mobilizes. Such a reading would then attend to the ways in which issues and depictions of inclusion and exclusion, state-related belonging and unbelonging go beyond the recognized bounded geographies of the US to take into account the logics of race and empire that determine such belongings within the bounds of the nation-state and beyond it. In this way, belonging as well as citizenship are no longer bounded by or restricted by the geographical borders of the US nation-state, but are then determined by the reach of US empire into geopolitical sites to determine which bodies are not only or merely human, but which bodies are worthy of acknowledgement, inclusion, and most importantly, protection, and which are not, and thus erased, by virtue of the role they can play in asserting and furthering imperial power. As Slahi himself states in his book, addressing his captors, and I quote, "You're holding me because your country is strong enough to be unjust, and it's not the first time you have kidnapped Africans and enslaved them," unquote. So it's interesting then here how this statement develops a certain genealogy of citizenship and nationhood that is premised on the bondage of Black bodies in early formations of the US nation, compelling us to think about how race, religion, nationality, and culture have been continuously been mobilized as yardsticks for determining rights, citizenship, belonging, and justice, not only in the US, but in a global context as well. The strength of the text as a testimonial then adheres to Shoshana Fellman and Dory Loeb's study of how testimonials develop out of bearing witness to trauma, with the act of bearing witness analyzed from the perspective of both the speaker who is testifying and the listener who is listening and reading. The testimonial narratives then that I'm looking at here grow out of the act of standing witness to and testifying about traumatic experiences from a personal as well as a collective perspective. And it's important here to think about how these testimonials are also a way of, are premised or dependent or contingent on having a listener, right? So it's not only in the act of speaking, but also there's an expectation of the act of listening too. And that's why the reader is important to think about here. It also becomes important to identify Guantanamo Diary as a testimonial narrative that points to Slahi's abilities to speak to, narrate his experiences, while at the same time pointing to the limits of testimonials or in their ability to fully articulate traumatic experiences. And that happens visually through the redactions and censors as manifested on the page. Again, the testimonial role here is not merely to prove the prisoner's humanity per se, but its content and structure signals the limits and impossibilities of articulations of trauma and the spaces where it would be fully received and processed. And so this is also a sample page, one of the pages of the books, and you can see here how most of the text has been censored. And more recently, there's been Slahi and his editor Seams have published a version of the book that shows where they're trying to piece together the information that was censored in the original text. And here we see how they have tried to piece together and reinsert the information that was initially redacted and censored in the original text. So there's a kind of process of reconstruction here that becomes really interesting. So the limits as well as constructed nature of the testimonial also become evident in the text in Slahi's admission to his providing false testimonials about people whom the US was trying to frame. And he says, during this period, I wrote more than 1,000 pages about my friends with false information, he recounts. I had to wear the suit the US intelligence tailored for me, and that is exactly what I did. So I'm not suggesting here that, though, that testimonials or reading the text as testimonial is a way to assert its lack of credibility, but rather to point to how it is shaped by political and affective context, state control, metaphorical suits, in order to think through how testimonials are constructed and circulated in ways that reinforce the state's role in determining who gets placed within the fictions or myths of national or shared global citizenships, or who has access to such constructs. So I'm going to move now and talk a bit about Philip Mitris's book of poems, Sand Opera, and by the way, they're both published in 2015. So, and this book also, the poems in it also depict acts of torture and violence exacted on the bodies of Arabs and Muslims, specifically men, including in places such as Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, and other secret global US-run sites of incarceration. So Sand Opera, and the title being a redacted form of the term Standing Operation Procedure, or SOP, provides poetic renditions drawn from various sources, and they include testimonies of prisoners and US soldiers at Abu Ghraib, the standard operating procedure manual used by the US Army at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, and the voices of the incarcerated and disappeared in black sites operated by the US across the world. So you see here on one side of the book, I have the book here because it's such a cool book. On one side, you have the testimonies given by several of the prisoners in Abu Ghraib. It's on this side of the book, and then facing testimonies given by the US soldiers. So what Phil Mitris has done is go and taken some of these testimonies and inserted them here and included some of the redactions that were, some of them were included in the original testimonials, but many of them I think he imposed himself. So in their depiction of the horrific, the painful, and the traumatic / traumatized, Mitris's poems highlight how political power, as well as the lack of it, shaped the construction and deployment of narratives in times of crises, dictating whose voices are heard and folded into a national discourse of heroism, citizenship, patriotism, and vulnerability, and whose perspectives are rendered literally and discursively invisible. I argue that the poems in Sand Opera, in confronting, documenting, and narrating trauma, specifically the traumas of the unnamed and the voiceless in the US-led war in Iraq, war, and the so-called war on terror, incorporate and at the same time complicate the use of the testimonial by incorporating, through their poetic structure, the very same methods of erasure, redaction, and omission the testimonial is often seen to be resisting. In other words, by replicating such erasures and omissions, a text like Sand Opera not only points to the limitations of hegemonic narratives about Muslims and Arabs, but they in fact serve to rewrite in some way such hegemonic narratives through poetic and visual transgressions. Divided into 5 sections, Sand Opera captures what at first glance seems like a cacophony of voices and perspectives, all nevertheless funneled through an evocative arrangement combining the audible and the visual. So the book's first section, and the book's first section is called Abu Ghraib Areas, and it was originally published as a separate chapbook, and then it was incorporated in this longer book. So it places, as I said, the narratives of and testimonies of Abu Ghraib prisoners in conversation with those by their US captors, as we see here. Based on the depositions made by the Iraqi prisoners at Abu Ghraib, all titled Echo X, these poems are literally juxtaposed with poems, as I said, that integrate statements made by US soldiers involved in the scandal, as well as excerpts from a standard operating procedure manual used by the US military at Guantanamo Bay. In both sets of poems, Mitris uses erasure and redaction to poetically and visually recreate and thus challenge the censorship that the US government enforces to discursively conceal and sanitize its acts of military aggression. Incorporating the exact descriptions of the acts of torture that the prisoners were subjected to, the Echo X poems defy the erasure and the censorship of these prisoners' voices and perspectives, even when visually emulating the methods used to censor and restrict information deemed too graphic for American sensibilities. So the second of the Echo X poems incorporates, for example, a prisoner's description of the beatings he received from the U.S. soldier Charles Grainer, who became known to be the mastermind behind these torture tactics, mainly to exonerate the top military brass who actually enforced these tactics. So we see here, oh, I'm sorry, this is cut. Okay, we'll leave it at this. So we see here a description of the testimony that one of the prisoners gave. And we see here also that Filmetris does a couple of things. He does include straight up redactions, and by having the lines being completely blacked out. But he also does this thing where he has a variation in the color of the text, right? And where we have darker text juxtaposed against like a lighter print. So we see that, and the use of erasure here to de-emphasize and literally de-highlight the violent acts exacted on the prisoners' bodies, especially when placed alongside the redacted and covered up lines from the prisoners' testimonies, produces a jolting visual mapping that exemplifies how evidence of torture at Abu Ghraib has been suppressed and censored by U.S. government officials. However, the Echo X poems that I just showed you do not seek to rectify the political illiteracy that is the ultimate result of the censorship they depict. They do not fill in the blanks of erased and missing narratives. They do not aim to make readily visible or available information, whether about the prisoners' identities, their names, their specific histories and positionalities, that is relegated to the margins of U.S. national discourse. By poetically deploying the forms and structures that underscore the state's acts of censorship, however, these poems compel the reader to confront how information is manipulated and edited to produce and promulgate narratives of exceptionalism and legality in a context of pervasive and illegal acts of wars and torture. Moreover, the unnamed, and you see here that with the text that's reflecting the prisoners' testimonials and perspectives, it's always unnamed. We don't have names with that. And in a lot of poems, this is from standard operating procedure, but in the other poems, the names of the soldiers do exist and we know who they are. So the unnamed, unidentified, and hence unknown identities of the Iraqi prisoners who speak through the Echo X poems are overshadowed and rendered even more marginal by the specificity of subjectivity and experience that the naming of the soldiers allows. So here there's a specific thing that's happening through naming. The Echo X poems collectively contain an opposite poetic formulation, moving from a lyrical poetry. So here we see also how a lot of the text is, there's lesser redaction at the beginning of the book. So there's a movement from a lyrical poetry that captures fuller but still redacted and censored versions of the prisoners' testimonials toward a poetic form represented by the last Echo X poem that signals an utter breakdown and inefficiency of language as a tool to convey the horrors of being subjected to torture. So the upper part is from one of the earlier poems, and then by the last poem in that section of Abu Ghraib areas, we see just no words, just punctuation marks. Okay, so in the first Echo X poems, the reader is faced with details about the torture tactics carried out by the US military as narrated by the victim himself, who nevertheless remains nameless in the poem. And I also have to say that these testimonials that Filmitris uses are based on actual testimonials that the Abu Ghraib prisoners gave, and they were published by the Washington Post, and also they're republished in Mark Danner's book titled Torture and Truth, America, Abu Ghraib, and the War on Terror. So these are the sources, or some of the sources, that Filmitris himself uses. It is worth noting that the prisoner whose testimonial in the poem Echo X in the beginning draws from, even though unidentified and unnamed in the poem, is in fact Qasim Haddi Hilas, detainee number 151108. And the redacted form in which this prisoner's testimonial is replicated in a poem like Echo X in the beginning serves to poetically underscore whose point of view is privileged in the dominant national discourse and whose pain is literally and figuratively erased. So, and I've had this conversation actually with Filmitris, and I pointed out, like, why are the Echo X poems, why are they called Echo X poems? Why don't we hear or know the names of the prisoners? And you know, so we had an interesting discussion about it, and he said he wanted also to replicate that erasure as a way to point to that erasure of names, and what does that do in terms of us knowing these bodies and how they were tortured. And so there are other parts where, other than punctuation, you know, the whole poem is includes pronouns, me, he, I, he, repeated all over the poem. Such linguistic gaps and absences underscore how the interlinking of politics and aesthetics point to the limitations, if not impossibilities, of rendering acts of violence and torture visible and known to a larger US public, especially when these acts are inflicted on Arab and Muslim bodies. Such limitations, however, are not merely negative or pessimistic renditions of these prisoners' narratives, and this is something that Phil also, you know, reflected on. They gesture toward the centrality of acknowledging and documenting the prisoner's own subject positions through the reference of I, he, me, as well as the punctuating spaces, the pauses, the visual markers that render language legible and meaningful. Moreover, these spaces, bracketed by the punctuation marks, despite the absence and loss they evoke, loss of language, loss of power, as well as a sense of suffocating enclosure and in confinement, are also breathing spaces, gesturing toward life and continuity for the prisoners during their days, months, years at Abu Ghraib and after. And this is, you know, Phil's response that, you know, he's thinking about the spaces, and I have that also as a problem when I teach these poems, and the students look at me like, how are we supposed to read this? And so I asked him about it, and he's like, why don't you think about it as like breathing? So there's breathing in between these punctuation marks, which I think is a really good way of thinking about it. Writing about the power of documentary poetics to give voice to stories of people and movements that the mass media tend to ignore or misrepresent, as Mitris states. But while it may be that such poems will not stand up in a court of law, and I'm quoting Mitris here, they testify to the often unheard voices of people struggling to survive in the face of unspeakable violence. Their power resides in their negotiation between language of evidence and language of transcendence, unquote. Such a negotiation is an important one in sand opera, for while Mitris's documentary poetics in this book reveals acts of unspeakable violence, the poems self-consciously act as reminders of the perpetual limitations of such documentation, given the intrinsic power differentials these documents withhold, whether they be official, classified, declassified, or public ones. So, the Abu Ghraib area's poems' emphasis on exposing state-sanctioned violence and detainees' trauma through linguistic and visual omissions and inclusions is augmented in later poems in the book by the insertion of actual maps and diagrams within the poetic text. And this is still from Sand Opera. These maps and diagrams are drawn by the Yemeni prisoner, Muhammad Farag Ahmad Bashmillah, to visually represent the details of some of the spaces within the secret sites in which he was imprisoned and tortured by US intelligence from October 2003 until May 2005. After this period, he was turned over sorry, I lost my spot. He was turned over to the Yemeni government after or before being finally released in March 2006 without any explanations or any charges of terrorism. The diagrams provided by Bashmillah, literally embedded in Mitris's poems, and I don't know if you can see it, are part of Bashmillah's testimony detailing his capture, imprisonment, and torture. So in this poem, Black Site exhibit Bashmillah's drawing of his prison cell inside a facility in Afghanistan, which is a secret site operated by the US military, is printed on vellum paper and laid over excerpts from Bashmillah's testimonial. So the text around the diagram is actually taken from Bashmillah's testimonial. And so here we have the vellum paper that has the diagram, and then when you take it and put it over the following page, then we have the diagram literally embedded in the text that is based on his testimonial. In its visual depictions of the invisible prison sites of the War on Terror and their inclusion of victims' voices that are erased from official governmental dispatches, a poem like this one shows how form, text, and image are layered to form a palimpsest that makes visible and immediate the omissions and gaps that structure dominant national understandings of this protracted terror war, to quote Phil Mitris. In this way, the book's structure itself, and not only its contents, directly attends to a poetics of dissent and witnessing. For these maps challenge the obscurity of such torture chambers and prison cells, and by extension, the secrecy of what Layla Khalili calls the zones of invisibility and violence, and by doing so, insist on interrogating the mythology of the US as a site of inclusion, multiculturalism, and freedom. So going back to the slide, outlining the suffocating dimensions of the prison cell and meticulously labeled to reveal Bashmillah's visual testimonial, his intimate knowledge of the different parts of this small space, we see here, a central diagram appears in the middle of the page, preceded by 4 lines of poetry and followed by another 4 lines. So Philip Mitris's aesthetic choices and the poetic forms he deploys in Sand Opera make visible and immediate the political landscapes that enable certain narratives to be highlighted and others to be erased. Such a viewpoint is central for countering the ways in which Arabs, Muslims, and Arab Americans have been rendered invisible and voiceless in their hyper-visibility. An irony that Mitris himself describes as the vertigo of feeling unheard as an Arab American in the decade after the terrorist attacks in 2001. After 9/11, he states, Americans turned an ear to the voices of Arabs and Muslims, though often it has been a fearful or selective hearing. Such selectivity of hearing and of representation is fully exposed in a book like Sand Opera, taking on a linguistic and visual dimension that pushes at the limits of visibility and invisibility. In doing so, it highlights the inextricable connections between art and politics through the self-same visual markers of omission and excision that often relegate Arab and Muslim voices, here specifically the victims of US empire, to the margins of history and knowledge production. The role of testimonial then here, and specifically the way it is engaged with and circulated through artistic and literary mediums, directly resists the singularity of a dominant lens or investment in humanizing the voiceless, the powerless, or the bodies that are literally rendered invisible. Rather, the reader's or listener's role is not to bestow recognition onto the other, but to recognize one's own proximity to, complicity in, or replication of dominant paradigms that ultimately reinstate exclusionary enactments of citizenships and belongings. Slahi's statement I mentioned earlier when he said goodness is transnational, transcultural, and transethnic should give us pause to reflect on how the goodness he is referring to here is in fact one shaped by transnational, transcultural, and transethnic political and ethical stances, as well as critical reading practices. Without that acknowledgement, statements about people's goodness, just like about people's humanity, often become mere commodities aimed at selling books or proclaiming groundbreaking memoirs at the expense of justice and liberation. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions, comments, feedback.
Just a very quick question about the publishers.
Yeah, I think they might need the mic. Yeah.
I just had a question. I mean, I have many questions, but the simplest would be to start with, like, who's publishing their works, and what kind of visibility do they gain after having come out of the prison cells? I mean, there's the visibility through having published alone, and then there's, I mean, do they get to be interviewed? Do they appear on TV? You know, so that's it. And how do the publishers? What do they get out of it? To what extent do they get a positive and or negative reputation for actually, showing what the U.S. government is precisely trying to hide?
Right.
Yeah,
I think, part of the critique is that the publishers are very invested in Anchor Books, so they published Slahi's book. Alice James Press is a smaller press, and they published Phil Mitras. I think these are two very different presses doing very different work. So that's why I wanted to differentiate between what the press is doing, what the writer is doing, and what the reader and the role of the reader. So I think these are separate, very different things happening there. But with the Slahi's book, the Guantanamo Diary, it became a national bestseller and all that. But that speaks, that alone is a way to think about how these texts are being circulated and marketed in very specific ways for gain, and I would say that gain is not going to Slahi for sure. And he might be getting some publicity, some interviews, but a lot of these prisoners are actually come out of these sites completely broken and completely traumatized and broken is, I think, the right word here. So in order to think that a book like that is going to be any form of adequate compensation, I think would be inaccurate. Inaccurate, yes.
Or a platform.
Yeah, or a platform for what? Because, in some ways, even with this kind of platform, their individual voices and experiences and are continuously erased, right? So in ways that there's no recognition, there's no compensation, and they have to live their lives with these experiences. So we have to kind of think critically about that. What compensation do they get, or what kind of platforms, which I think is very limited. I think the press has more to gain in circulating these kinds of texts, and specifically targeting certain audiences that then, mainstream audiences would buy this book and then get a good feeling. Is like, I read these experiences of this one prisoner, and now I can feel that I'm more informed, and audiences or certain readers feel better about themselves. So that's a kind of liberal discourse that I'm trying to critique here in order to think about a critical engagement with these texts and pushing against these claims of humanity and leaving it at that. Yeah. Hi, Ken.
Hi, Carol. Thank you so much for this great talk. I'd like to know if you have you done any work on the history of prison narratives? This is all very shocking, and I'm wondering if, during Vietnam there was something similar, or during the internment of Japanese is this something new and exceptional and, you know, we've reached a new low in, you know, American society, how they treat the so-called enemies?
I think there's always been this narrative of exceptionalism, of moving toward certain practices that are then legalized in ways that one can argue are illegal. So there's a way to justify how these actions happen, and we saw that being done blatantly under George W. Bush and his administration. Right, so there was an investment in producing and revisiting international laws, and so, for example, to change the name from prisoners to enemy combatants. So that way is a way to evade, following the Geneva Conventions, for example. So there was investment in that was quite blatant during the George W. Bush presidency. And we see that with his legal team, John Yoo, producing the famous torture memos, and in order to kind of revisit and rewrite the laws to justify torture, basically.
But was this business as usual for an American administration, or is this something exceptionally egregious?
I think it has a long history in U.S. military involvement abroad, but the language of exceptionalism is here being mobilized in order to justify these acts after 9/11, and it's being used as a way to bolster national and patriotic narratives and investments, and also to garner support for the Iraq War and the invasion of Afghanistan. But that definitely, I would say, did not start with 9/11. It has a long history before that, but in some way it was enabled to become more blatant after 9/11 through that discourse of exceptionalism. That these are times when we have to mobilize, we have to incarcerate people in this way. But also, I mean, what's interesting about these texts is to kind of place them not only as texts that are produced and convey experiences of those prisoners over there, but I think the important link is to think about the connections with prison narratives within the US, and specifically the prison industrial complex and its production of racialized and gendered prison population, and how these two things should be thought about in conjunction with each other, I would say. Yeah.
I'd like to ask you about the choice of form, specifically poetry, in relation to this particular emphasis that you are highlighting. And then, I was just thinking about these verses. Whenever I saw if I in my cell, I was filled with joy. Okay, and I'm just wondering, I mean, had that been one full sentence, then would that have changed the impact of the message of the resistance gesture, basically, that is being fashioned and emphasized through this particular juxtaposition?
Yeah, I think this was one sentence, and I don't want to suggest that filmetrists just took these testimonials and plopped them on the page and then they became poetry, right? There is a certain way of breaking the line in a very specific way that becomes Mitris's intervention in this testimony, and that makes it, and then he's using that poetic form to present it in this way. So to kind of give, maybe this is a way of giving Phil Mitris credit as a poet in producing it, right? But with the thoughtfulness of acknowledging that these are testimonials, but he's breaking the lines in a specific way that asserts that poetic form in that way.
And what about the Mecca reference? Is this like just incidentally to this side and thus outside of the framework?
Oh, that's
of a
interesting.
particular,
Yeah.
I mean, visual orientation. You know, it's on the basically left, and thus it goes basically as it does in Arabic. Usually, the writing in Arabic, as opposed to going from you know left to right, which is the English or the
Yeah. So these diagrams, the prisoner himself recreated from memory. And my sense was that they did have a sign, you know, so that the prisoners can pray, right? So, but yeah, it's literally, and I would say also figuratively, then outside the frame.
because there's no mention, there's no basically like orientation.
Right. Yeah.
Point anywhere
Right.
where you can say, okay, this is basically where it is specifically located.
So it's a disorienting orientation.
Exactly.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
And also, follow up, where do you start reading this? Spatial poetry. I mean, do you start left, right, or do you read from
Right.
you? I mean, then based perhaps partly on the way you read it or in which direction you read it, you might also come up with a different
Yes. Absolutely.
interpretation.
Yes.
Yeah, I was intrigued by the fact that all of the examples here are in English. Were they translated or were they written in English originally? Or are they, you know?
They were translated.
Okay.
I thought I had let me see. So this is a copy from Mark Danner's book that recreates or is an example of one of the testimonies, and it is given in Arabic, and then you have here the name of the translator.
Okay.
And so with Guantanamo Diary, Slahi wrote it in English, and he actually learned English in prison and then wrote the 466-page manuscript. Yes, yes. And actually, it has been translated into Arabic. I just saw yesterday that there's an Arabic version. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's good.
Even though, you know, Arabic is his first language, but yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah. Any other questions? Amazing the visual quality of these works. Yeah, how they work with the visual. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.